don't know that I have ever had an open to a show where I plan to talk so much about words coming out of Lane Kiffin's mouth in sort of a prophetic tone. We've talked about Lane Kiffin a lot, but it's never in a, well, that's a good point sort of tone. So let's dive into this. There are many benefits to having Lane Kiffin in college football. One of them is you're never short on quotes. Anytime something happens, i.e. Jimbo Fisher and Nick Saban going at each other, you're sure to have him tell you what he thinks, and he did that. And then with Ross Dellinger over at Sports Illustrated, he really went in depth, and that piece got released yesterday over on SI.com. Some of you have already read it, but I had so many of you, dozens, maybe hundreds, reached out and said, what do you think about this? So I figured we'd lead the show with it tonight. And I'm going to show you, if you haven't already read this, I'm going to show you 3 different very noteworthy quotes that came from Lane Kiffin in this Ross Dellinger piece over on SI.com. And the first one has to do with free agency in college football, because that's what a lot of people have referred to NIL as. And to be clear, what he's talking about here in this wide-ranging interview is the state of college football right now. And Kiffin had a lot to say, as he usually does, but man, I'm telling you, this is different than normal. Like, Kiffin's saying a lot of stuff that I think some folks are scared to speak out about, and he's just never been that way. He really doesn't have much of a filter on him. So, Colin, throw up this first quote about free agency, and I'm going to pull it up over here. Listen to this. If you're riding around and you're listening on podcast, if you're watching on YouTube, listen to this. This is Lane Kiffin speaking about NIL and the transfer portal. We're a professional sport, and they are professional players. Contracted employees, but without contracts. They can get out whenever they want. How is it not being seen that unless there are changes of rules around caps and contracts, how is every elite college player not at the end of their season entering the transfer portal? This is something that is feared and didn't quite come to fruition this past cycle like many thought it would. I know you saw a lot of kids enter the transfer portal, but believe me, behind the scenes, there was a worry that like half of everyone's roster was going to enter the transfer portal. Why is that? Well, Lane Kiffin's telling you right now. The reason a lot of people look at this as unsustainable, although those are not his words, but they are people like my words, it's unsustainable because you have some of the elements of free agency that exist in the NFL. You have the ability to go test the market, but you don't have any parameters in place. What Lane Kiffin said, he kind of went on to mention Bryce Young. He said, I can't believe Bryce Young did not enter the transfer portal, even if he had no intention of leaving Alabama. There's nothing on that scholarship piece of paper that he signed with Alabama that limits him from doing it. And now you've got this market where you can put your name out there and just see what the highest bidder has to say. Like I've been in contract renegotiation phase for about 6 months now. You're in a market where you see what people say. But see, unlike college football players, I'm locked into CBS for a certain amount of time, and then I've got a negotiation window, and then whoever I sign with, then I've got X number of years that I can't talk to anybody else for. It's the same way in the pros, no matter if it's baseball, football, basketball. But in college right now, that is not the case. And so Lane Kiffin made a very good point that I think a lot of folks are only just now realizing, because it's so new. Everything about this is new. I would venture to guess several high-profile college football players, if they were to read that, would think to themselves, wow, that's a good point, which means they didn't even understand immediately that's possible. But it is possible. And like he said, like Lane Kiffin said, if nothing changes, that will be the norm, which is why, stands to reason, there's a lot of grinding of teeth right now in different conference sectors because something has to change, because that's obviously untenable. I know a lot of people have entered the room, stressed the word entered the room recently, which means they weren't always here. They are not college football diehards. They don't eat, sleep, and breathe it. They're just passersby, kind of like the Locusts. And once they get rid of this field and everything good about it, then they'll move on to the next field. But a lot of people have come in the room lately, and they've told you, there's nothing wrong with that. That's just the way it's going to work. It's the way it should work. No, it's not. No, it's not. It's not the way it should work. That's coming from a vantage point of someone that has 14 different agendas and ulterior motives, none of which are the best interest of college football. So everyone's entitled to their opinion, as I've said many times on the show. I just don't have to respect all the opinions. I don't respect the opinion, on this topic at least, of anyone who says, oh, free agency every year, kids entering the portal every year, that should be normal. That's just the way it should work. No, it's not. No, it's not. So we move on. Lane Kiffin also talked about the locker room. He's not alone here. I've had several of you message me about this. But he went a step further, did Lane Kiffin, talking not only about the locker room, but also about how players are being bought in the NIL market. This from Lane Kiffin. He said, there are all kinds of issues coming. Let's say reports are true. Some high school quarterback is making 6 to 8 mil. How's that going to work? How is he coming into that locker room? Are coaches going to need to play him? This is where it gets real. Listen to this. Are coaches going to need to play him, or are donors going to be mad when he's not playing? The first round pick the donor drafts? I've been in that situation. He's talking about coaching in Oakland when they drafted Jamarcus Russell, and Jamarcus Russell wasn't ready to play, but Al Davis, the GM's telling him, I drafted that guy number 1 overall. You know how much money I'm paying him? You better play him. Well, Lane Kiffin's talking about that existing in the college world now. He continues, the people paying that kind of money are going to want that guy to play. If he's not playing, how's the backup quarterback who's just earning a scholarship going to play over him? Do you think this will happen? I do. Not all over the place. I think it'll be case by case. I think you've got to get a whole lot more nuanced on this conversation. This could exist at Oklahoma one year. It could happen at Virginia Tech one year, whereas at Illinois it may not happen, or at USC a given year it may not happen. I'm mentioning those programs generically. The more specific point here is this will happen. The locker room issue's not worried me so much. I've not been focused on that because my philosophy on that has been that's not going to break up a locker room that wasn't already prone to being broken up before. Because before the NIL era, if you've ever been in a locker room, if you've been around this sport, if you've watched this sport for a long time, you could probably recall teams that underachieved, and after the season's over and all the stories get told, you find out they just had a bad locker room dynamic. Well, how did it happen before NIL? The answer is poor culture. You had a few bad apples in the bushel and they spoiled the whole barrel. You can go back to the Aesop's Fables world and you can know what wrecks a college football locker room. The point is, I've always been of the opinion that if you got stable culture there, if you got good culture, this probably won't wreck it nearly as quickly as if you got bad culture. Now, if you got bad culture, this will wreck it quicker than it would in the past. But it was already going to be wrecked anyway. So I'm not worried about that as much. But the second part of what Kiffin said there, oh, that's a huge problem. And it's going to happen. That's an inevitability. Think about forking over the kinds of money you have to participate in these collectives and whatnot, and knowing that that money went to get a 5-star defensive end, that all the recruiting services had rated that. And so in your mind, he's the number 1 player at his position in the country. He comes in, okay, he's a special teams contributor the first half of his freshman season. But man, after we get out of the bye week, and we're in the home stretch there in November, and he's still not starting, what did I pay for? So who am I getting mad at? Not the kid, not the recruiting service. I'm getting mad at the coach. And that cannot happen. For 10 obvious reasons, that cannot happen. But yet, Lane Kiffin suggests, and I agree, that it will happen. Part 2, why this is very unsustainable. And part 2 of why when anyone walks in the door and says, oh, that's going to be normal, and that's okay, don't listen to them. Those are casuals. And what do we do with casuals? We reach over to the volume knob, we turn it down to 0, and then we smile at them and wave at them. And you just see a moving mouth, but there's no actual words coming out that you can hear. It's the best way to deal with casuals in and out of college football. Lane Kiffin continues. Let's talk about some money here, shall we? Lane Kiffin said, this is talking about recruiting specifically, I could have worked my butt off for 3 years. You could have done 3 minutes. There was a player who went to a school that we got beat on. I asked him about the relationship with the head coach. He had never talked to him. NIL. Lane Kiffin's talking about something that's interested me, but I have not spoken about on the show quite yet. And that's the concept that there could be really, really good recruiting jobs being done, but it doesn't matter because money will always win out. A lot of people have gotten mad at kids about this. You don't need to be getting mad at kids about it. They're not doing anything different than you would, whether you're 18 years old or 48 years old. If you've got an opportunity here, and then someone offers you 4 times the amount you would make here over there, where are you going? I know where most of you are going. You're probably going the same place I would go. Doubly, especially if I were 18 years old. I can't get mad at kids for making that decision. Every one of us in that position will make that decision. Lane Kiffin's not demonizing kids here, quite the opposite. He said we shouldn't be getting mad at the kids. It's the adults that kick the can down the road. The kids weren't born yet. The kids we're talking about right now were not even born yet when the decisions should have been being made that would have maybe avoided us winding up where we are right now. But we are here. And so from this point moving forward, what do you have? Possible solutions? Maybe. I'll talk about it in a second. But what Lane Kiffin's talking about here is money will always win out. That kind of brings me to another part of why this has to be solved or something has to happen. That is a theme that is woven throughout every quote I just read you. But now how about some unanswerable questions? I'm just going to throw some of them at you. By the very definition of an unanswerable question, I don't have these answers. But think about putting together a coaching staff in the future. Lane Kiffin said, hey, if you're a head coach in the future, all you're going to ask about with a school is, what does your NIL structure look like? Because that will be the most important thing when it comes to winning, unless something changes. Well, I'm thinking about head coaches hiring assistant coaches. What do you value? Because right now you value recruiting. In fact, you cut corners sometimes on a guy's ability in the X's and O's department just because you know he can acquire talent. He's a good recruiter. There are very, very notable examples in college football of super recruiters that are, whatever, on game day, but what they bring you on the trail more than makes up for what they may lack on the grease board. Is that the same moving forward? If this really becomes an NIL game, if it just becomes a transactional game, what value is there for the super recruiter, for the A-level recruiter who is a C-level coach? Is there still a place for that guy in the game? And does it change the way that you construct your staff? And could also this open the door for more high school coaches? Because I can promise you this. Here's a dirty little secret. There are some guys holding down jobs, making six figures on your college staff that probably would have circles drawn around them on said grease board by some of the bigger high school staffs and people on those high school staffs in your hometown. The difference is, for whatever reason, maybe it's the agent that represents them, or maybe it's the way they carry themselves in the recruiting trail, or maybe it's just they've got more experience, that coach on the college staff can acquire talent. Whereas this coach at the high school level, he's just got chalk all over his hands. He's just a grinder, man. I don't want him out on the recruiting trail. Well, if that doesn't matter so much anymore, you got a lot of guys at the high school level that would get calls tomorrow. If recruiting wasn't a huge factor in the game anymore, you got a bunch of high school coaches that would have college jobs, boom, just like that. Just think about that. That's an unanswerable question because I don't know if this structure is going to stay this way forever. Therefore, I don't know if any long-term permanent changes in the direction of the sport are going to occur. How aggressive are conferences going to be? And this is going to start to be answered, I think, next week down in Destin when the SEC has their spring meetings. This is the biggest question right now. I've spoken about this for the last two shows. You've got this Hail Mary approach out there of let's get Congress involved. I've told you I've changed my thinking on that. I don't think that's the way it's going to go. And so the follow-up is, well, if the NCAA can't do it for threat of lawsuit and a 9-0 SCOTUS decision against them, let's take it upon ourselves to police things at the college level. I expect the SEC to be pretty bold on this, and that's why I almost wish this Lane Kiffin interview would have come 2 weeks after it did. I'd love to get these guys on the record after their spring meetings. Because one way or the other, this is going to be addressed very poignantly in those spring meetings down in Destin next week. What do they walk away thinking then? That's what I'd love to know. Unknowable at the moment. Here's one that's just totally off the wall. Right now, if you think about a career in football, if you think about making big money in football right now, you think, I've got to make it to the NFL. If you're 5 years old right now, or if you're the parents of a 5-year-old kid right now, and you're thinking about which sport to sign him up for, boy, it's such a long shot to ever get anything financially in the sport of football unless you make it to the NFL, right? Yeah, that's the way it's always been. Youth football participation rates have declined, not because of that, but because of the injury and you can go play soccer. There's just so many more safer options. I wonder what this will do for youth football participation. This could be a plus, could be a hidden plus of NIL. If all of a sudden, and especially if all of a sudden some of these conferences start giving a small sliver of that multimedia distribution rights pie to players, all of a sudden you don't have to make it to the NFL anymore to make really good money playing football. You can make it as an 18-year-old playing for the University of Missouri. You could make it playing for Purdue. I almost wonder, if someone's on the fence about letting kids play football, or if someone's on the fence when they're a freshman in high school, do I want to go just stick to baseball, or do I want to stick it out with football? I almost wonder if that's in the back of kids' minds. It's unknowable. I don't know. We're too early in it. And also, how much correction is going to occur? You know the crowd over here? I keep pointing to them. It's the crowd that comes in the door because they weren't here already, and they talk about how, all your fears, they're unfounded. You're scared of things just because it's unknown, but don't worry. The market will correct itself. How many times have you heard that? I say it all the time in economics. I don't say it all that often in college football normally because it doesn't apply. But I also don't know that it applies here quite yet. Or at least I'm not as confident in that because I don't think we have true market forces at work here the way we would just in an open economic free market. I think that there's a lot that's artificial about this market in particular. And because of that, I don't know how quickly it corrects. When people tell you, to be clear what I'm talking about here, when people say it'll correct, they're normally talking to someone who's freaking out and saying NIL is going to ruin college football. These folks won't be able to compete against those folks, yada, yada, yada. And they'll tell you, oh, don't worry. Those numbers won't be that astronomical forever because some boosters are going to spend big money on players. They'll get burned when they don't pan out. And then the market will correct and it'll level off the way that a typical market would work. Lane Kiffin talked about that. He said, I don't think that's the case at all. I don't know that I don't agree with him. I think that was like a triple-double negative. But I'm not so sure Lane Kiffin's not probably onto something there. I think there are a lot of artificial forces already in this market, meaning I think there are a lot of price tags being attached to certain players that if this were a true market would not represent what that player is actually worth. I think that a lot of these donors and boosters couldn't even care less what the player's name is. They just know that's an asset that team needs. And in some ways, well, that is how a market works. In other ways, that's not leveling off. I don't think that outside of maybe a few programs that's leveling off because what Lane Kiffin said, and we'll wrap it up here, what Lane Kiffin said that's true is you've got some donor classes out there that are on the hook for paying $40 million to pay coaching staffs not to coach for them. What do you think $20 million per class is? That's actually to get players to come play here. They're willing to chuck out all that money to pay staffs to go away, to buy them out before they pay a new staff. And he's right about that. And so I don't know, absent conferences getting aggressive about this, what will change or what can change. And that's why that's the $1 million or maybe even $1 billion question. What are conferences going to do to get aggressive about this? You will hear a lot more about that probably around this time next week.